So we've already seen that we have this special package.json file, and it isn't really used by Node itself, but rather by npm, the Node Package Manager, that program on your computer. And when you install a package, downloading it from the npm registry automatically, you can use --save in order to automatically save that reference to the package.json. Or you could build this package.json yourself or receive it from someone else and use npm install by itself, just that phrase, to automatically download all the dependencies. Now we called them dependencies because we use them in our app. My app won't run without this package. That's what I'm saying. However, there are other dependencies. Dependencies in which I'm using only during development. My app will run without them, but I need them during my development process. We call those development dependencies, and there's a way to specify those using npm and package.json as well. To see a really good example of this, I'll go to the command line and we'll do npm install, and then we'll get from the npm registry a package called jasmine-node. Now, Jasmine is a tool to help us write automated tests, to automatically test my software as I build it. Now, we're not going to focus on that in this course, but this is a really good example of a development dependency, a dev dependency. I don't need the tests for the app to actually run, but I do need it and want to use it while building my app. And other developers who might work on this with me should also have this installed. So I can either add this directly to the package.json or say --save -dev. That's the difference. Instead of --save, which saves it to a dependencies area in package.json, I can just say --save -dev. And then I'll hit enter, and it will go and download that from where the code is living in the npm registry. And if I come back and look at my package.json, I'll see that I have a dev dependencies entry now in the JSON file. And it looks just like the dependencies entry, works the same way. Here's the name of the package and the version that I'm using that can be automatically updated. To what degree can it be automatically updated? But it's not something that's needed for me to run the app. But it is still pulled into Node modules, the same location. There's a jasmine-node folder now in node_modules. And so I can make sure to tell the difference between what needs to go up on the server, for example, and what doesn't in order for the app to actually run. And in some cases, when you deploy Node, when you actually push it up to a server, you don't push the Node modules at all. In fact, on the best servers, you don't. There are utilities, server utilities that are already built in that will look at your dependencies and essentially run the npm install after you push up your code. So ultimately, the server where you place your code will do the same thing we just did. Install all the Node modules when you first deploy your code, push your code up to the server, and make sure that that node_modules folder has what is needed. And so it can ignore the dev dependencies, and the server can choose to just install the dependencies. So that's good to know. Now, we want to see one other thing. There's one other kind of package that we might use. It's a package that, again, doesn't have to be there for our app to run. And it is something that we're using for development. But it's something that we're using for development on all of our Node applications, or might use on all of our Node applications, not just this one particular. If I want that, then I'll go to the command line, clear this. I can do npm install, and then either before or after the package name, I'll do it before this time, -g. That means globally install this module. In other words, don't download it into the node underscore modules folder for this particular app, but rather put it in a location that npm and node can access it from anywhere on my computer, from any app that I'm working on. Where does it download? We'll see that in a second. But let's use something called nodemon. And this we'll actually use for the rest of this course, so you should try installing this. It downloads. Now, you might end up with some problems installing something globally from a permissions standpoint on your computer, especially if you're using Linux or Mac. And there's information on that you can find on the npm.js website and around Googling on the internet for globally installed packages that cause some kind of permissions problem on your computer. But what this did was download nodemon, and now it's available globally. Where did it install it? Well, that will depend on your setup and operating system. In my case here on Windows, it installed it deep down inside the data specific to the user that I'm logged in as on my Windows computer. And there's a node underscore modules folder found deep down in there, and I have nodemon installed. So there are various places where a package, a module could be installed. You might have a local module. You might have one downloaded from npm, installed locally in a local node underscore modules folder. You might have something installed in a global node underscore modules folder. And all those places are places where Node can go and look for things. Now, one other thing worth noting is that nodemon itself has its own node modules folder. And actually, if we were to look over in jasmine-node, it also does. So let's pop back over there. Node modules, jasmine-node has a node modules folder. And some of the dependencies that Jasmine has their own node modules folder, which are its dependencies. So we can see that whatever's installed into the node underscore modules folder comes along with its own dependencies for it to run. For Jasmine-node to run, it needs these. And for this to run, it needs these, etc. This is actually something that is a bit criticized with npm. Every package contains its own dependencies, and then dependencies inside there contain their own dependencies, things that they need to run. And so a lot of times we'll have things duplicated around here within the node underscore modules folder. That's a big reason why we don't push this whole thing to our server or into our code repositories, because this can get pretty big. But it's okay because it allows us to manage and deal with different dependencies using different versions of the same dependency and a lot of problems that you can have with package management systems. So by simply saying each package will contain what it needs, it will be self-contained, then we avoid really having to think too hard about what packages depend on what other packages and have the same dependencies. We just say the folder works. And that's why Node made that choice, and it works. And it works well. One last thing before we look at using nodemon, which we install globally. What if the version of one of my dependencies is now old? What if there's a newer version out? Well, the tilde and the caret take care of what version I'll allow to be updated. But I don't have to think too hard. I can just go to the command line and say npm update. Run that. And it looks at all the dependencies that I have installed, that is the code I have downloaded and referenced in package.json, checks for newer versions that match what I said were allowed to update, and then updates them. So if there had been a newer version of one of these, it would have downloaded it, overwriting the version that's in node underscore modules. So that's a very simple way to make sure as I'm developing that I'm always using the latest version of other people's code that I'm using as part of my app. All right, so what about nodemon? I've opened up the code that we finished the last section with when we were talking about HTTP and building a web server. And we routed based on the URL to different content, an HTML file, a JSON file, and a 404. So let's use nodemon. We installed it globally, which means that because when I went and looked at the documentation for nodemon, after it's installed globally, I can just use it in the command line. The reason being that nodemon comes with what's called a command line interface utility. Often you'll see that NPM packages will have something that lets you use them in the command line. And if they have it and you have it installed, then you should just be able to use it in the command line. Just like I did node itself. In fact, I can just say nodemon app.js. And it starts the command node app.js. But inside of it, nodemon, or node monitor, watches the files in your app using built-in functionality from the FS module within Node. And it watches these files and waits for them to change. And if any of the files change, nodemon automatically cancels node and runs that node command again, pointing at the JavaScript file that I gave nodemon. So I gave nodemon app.js, so it ran node app.js, and if any of the files in this folder that I'm pointing at that I'm sitting on in the command line change, it will stop node and then run node app.js again. Exactly what we had to do this whole time. So if I go to localhost, for example, there's hello world. Now we know we can change the HTML file because that isn't part of the code that was converted to machine language. But let's say, example, I have /API, and let's say I change this URL as I'm doing this during development. So I change this, let's say, to /JSON. I save the file, and if I go back, we can see that nodemon said restarting due to changes, and then ran node app.js again. I didn't have to do that manually. And now if I refresh, I get a 404, and I can go to /JSON. So all nodemon did was automate whenever I save a file, stopping and restarting node. So that's terrific. Now I don't have to use nodemon. It's not required for my app to run. And it really isn't a dev dependency because you can do development without it. But I've installed it globally so that I can use it when I want to, on any of the apps that I want to. And we're actually going to use it throughout the course. Again, you don't have to. You could manually stop and start Node if you like. But we're going to use it so we don't have to stop and think about it. And I like using it during real development. Save the file, come back, refresh. I'm all good. Make sense? All right. Oh, a quick note on the command line interface part of nodemon. You can find it in its source code. It's in a folder called CLI. CLI stands for Command Line Interface. And you'll actually see this quite a bit throughout packages in the NPM registry. In fact, if you see a package name that has a -CLI in it, that means most likely that it's a utility meant to be used in the command line. So just be aware of that, because sometimes you'll have a utility with a particular name, and then that same name with a -CLE, which means that you have a utility probably that you're going to use in code, and then another version of that utility that's meant to be used just typing it into the command line. So this is the idea of NPM, useful things, other people's code, available to me out there on the internet. And I can download it from the NPM registry, register it in the package.json file as dependencies or dev dependencies. They're in the node_modules folder, so I can grab them with the require function. This is how Node caused such a huge explosion of open source code, because it made it so easy to grab and use. And so I have access to this entire library of tens of thousands of other people's code modules. Pretty neat, right? Some of them are new, some of them are incredibly popular and have been around a long time. But the idea is I can easily say, this is what I'm using, install it, update it, and just focus on building good software.